Well, welcome everyone. We are so glad you're here to this event. And please, if everyone can turn off their cell phones. And there are bathrooms in the hallway. And there's an exit the way you came in, and there's also another exit here in case anyone needs that. So,
I think the mic's not working.
it's not.
Maybe turn it up a little bit.
Get closer to it.
And then, once upon a time, there was a little. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome. Okay. Maybe I should hold this. Okay.
Don't hold it.
No,
Okay.
can't hold it.
Okay, I won't touch it. Okay. So please turn your cell phones off if you didn't hear that. And there are bathrooms out there in the hall, and there's an exit door here as well as the one that you came in. And we'll start with the land acknowledgement. The 21 municipalities of Addison County sit on land that belongs to the Western Abenaki, the traditional caretakers of these Vermont lands and waters, which they call Endakina, or homeland. The land has served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples since time immemorial. We remember their connection to this region and the hardships they continue to endure. We give thanks for the opportunity to share in the bounty of this place and to protect it. We are all one in the sacred web of life that connects people, animals, plants, air, water, and earth. Okay.
Good thing we're the same size.
I think if we push the speaker back, it won't be in line with the mic, which is causing the feedback.
Push. Do it?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Welcome.
How about now? Is that better? Still reverberating a little bit.
You have to have the speaker in front of the. Because it's in line with the frequency.
Oh, okay. Is this better?
Yeah.
Still doing something a little weird. Okay. I'm going to tell you a little bit of. Turn it off. I'll just talk about it.
You were fine.
You think it was okay? Okay. All right. I want to tell you a little bit about Pollinator Pathway of Addison County, which is the co-sponsor of this event. 2 years ago, Bethany Berry invited people to her home in September 2021, her home in Cornwall, to talk about native pollinators and how we could help. I came from Weybridge, bringing Brett Gilman, a second semester student at Middlebury College, and he introduced us to the Pollinator Pathway Northeast, which was founded in his hometown in Connecticut. So we learned about this and we thought, well, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we thought we'll focus our interests and our activism with this organization. And we joined the Pollinator Pathway of Northeast, and then they taught us how to do this organization. We realized early on that we had to educate ourselves first because we were all neophytes. And then we could start helping to educate other people. So we formed a steering committee, and facilitators from the different towns volunteered to join us. And we now meet monthly, and we've presented educational webinars, we've sponsored garden visits, we've held book discussions, and one of our members writes articles for the Addison Independent, our local newspaper. We've learned about and seen many pollinators, native flowers, and we aim to create connections and community and learn with our friends and neighbors. Some of the town groups have created beautiful educational pollinator gardens on public property, and most of our members are working in our own yards and landscapes to create pollinator habitat. and it's a work in progress, especially after last summer with all the rain. So, but we're learning. As you came in, there was a handout on the table with all the different towns and the facilitators where we currently have active groups. And if you don't see your town on there and you'd like to start one, you can come and see one of us, and we'd be happy to help you start a group in your town. It's nice to have a smaller town-sized group, and then the Addison County group is kind of the network, and we all come together to help each other out. Lots of other pollinator pathway groups are starting in Vermont, and also in other parts of the country. This is a growing movement. And we've noticed that other states were passing legislation to protect native pollinators, and that's one of our core principles, is to protect the pollinators from pesticides. So that's why we're here tonight. We're going to learn about how pesticides have become a serious threat to our native pollinators, to our soil, to our water, and all living things. So the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, who's our co-sponsor tonight, has started a statewide campaign called Protect Our Pollinators, which you hopefully have heard about. They're working on legislating neonicotinoids, which are an active threat to pollinators. So they're going to tell us tonight about how we can help with that campaign. So tonight, the format for tonight is, first we're going to hear from Emily May about the importance of native pollinators in our environment, our food system, and the plants and animals that depend on them. And then Paul Burns from VPIRG is going to speak about the VPIRG campaign. There'll be questions and answers at the end, so please hold your questions. And then we have handouts, we have seed giveaways, we have refreshments, and VPIRG has a table, so you can linger at the end, and hopefully we can talk to each other and share ideas. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Emily May. She's a pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society's pesticide program. She has a Master's of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University, and she studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, the effects of pesticides on wild bee communities. She's worked with Xerces since 2015, focused on supporting pollinators through habitat creation and protecting bees and other beneficial insects from pesticides. So all the things that we want to know about, because this is an area of growing concern. Emily has presented 2 very popular webinars for PPAC. Some of you have seen them, they're on YouTube. And now she's here in person for the first time, so we get to have her here with us. And she'll be speaking for about 20 minutes, then Paul will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers. So it's my pleasure to have Emily come up here.
All right, let's see if I can. My rowdy parents and my rowdy college co-captain of the frisbee team. Woo! All right, how's that? Good. Okay. So thank you for being here. It's great to see everybody. It's nice to not just be in front of my computer talking to you. It's nice to actually see you. So my name's Emily May. I live in Cornwall now. I am a pollinator conservation specialist with the pesticide program at Xerces. So today, you might learn a little bit more than you want to about the threat of pesticides to Vermont pollinators. But thankfully, we also have Paul here today to talk about how we can get involved, how we can all play a part in supporting these important insects in our state. This is a photo of a vulnerable species of bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, which I've found in my yard now for the last 3 years. I've also found a couple other cool imperiled insects in my yard. So it is definitely possible through habitat work and avoiding the use of pesticides to support these insects. Just as a little bit of background, part of the reason I'm excited to work here in Addison County on pollinator efforts is because this is where I got into pollinators. I was a student at Middlebury, and I did an independent study project on Vermont pollinators when I was working at the college garden, and ended up installing a native perennial garden outside of the science building, which is still there 15 years later, if you ever go by Hall. After Middlebury, I went to Michigan State and worked on getting my master's in studying bees on blueberry farms and in wildflower plantings. That's trying to figure out where bees nest and why they nest in different places. So that's an emergence trap that collects bees as they're coming out of the soil. After Michigan State, I came to Xerces, and Xerces is a nonprofit that works on conserving wildlife through the conservation of, and hopefully you can see some of these. The text is going to be a little bit small for folks in the back, so I apologize.
And Emily, you might step back a few inches if you can, because we're getting like a little ring on the
Are you
mic.
getting feedback?
I don't know what the right thing is to do.
Okay, I couldn't tell if you could hear that.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Great. Because I could hear it and I wasn't sure.
Yes,
Okay.
you can hear it.
Yeah, so Xerces works on all invertebrates. We have a big pollinator program, but we also have programs focused on endangered species. And all of these invertebrates are providing really important roles in our ecosystems, whether that's through decomposition or through pollination, forming the base of the food web. Insects and invertebrates are super important for all of our wildlife. Pollination is one of those important services that insects provide, and so plant-pollinator relationships are important to a lot of our different systems, both cropping systems and wild systems. Through the simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower, these pollinators are building out the base of the food chain for many species, and are also part of that food chain themselves in some cases. But when we think about bees, these bees are very important pollinators, VIPs, when most people think of a bee, they think first of a honeybee. And that is a single species that is very important for US agriculture, and for bakers and tea drinkers and people who like honey. But it's important to keep in mind, since we're talking about protecting all of Vermont's pollinators, that is one species, and that we have over 350 other species of bees that are also playing a role in our systems. Honeybees are a managed species, so they're more like livestock in a way, in the sense that we can bring in more bees from other places, we can manage their hives, we can monitor how they're doing over time, and that's less the case for native bees. But honeybees are also facing a variety of challenges. Even though they're a managed species, not at risk of extinction, they are facing challenges. So this is a graphic showing colony losses from a survey done by the Bee Informed Partnership. They surveyed beekeepers across the country. This is from the past year, all colony losses in different states around the country. Vermont lost about 42% of its colonies last year. The year before that was worse, lost over 70% of hives the year before. And since 2010, Vermont has lost anywhere from 15 to 85% of honeybee colonies every year. So it's not exactly a rosy picture for honeybees, but because these species are managed, it's more like if you can imagine chickens having avian flu and they deal with that challenge, they're managed. Honeybees face serious challenges from things like mites and viruses, but again, can be managed. The majority of our wild bee species we know less about. We know less about how they're doing. What do they need? Are they declining? What we do know, it comes from important work from Vermont Center for Eco Studies and others who have observed pollinators in our state. We know that we have about 353 species, give or take a few, and more than 10 times that number across the entire country. About 90%, almost 90% of Vermont's wild bee species live in the ground. So honeybees live above ground in their colonies. Most of our species are ground nesters. About a quarter of Vermont's bees are specialists, so they like to feed on one kind of plant or a small group of plants, things like willow specialists or plants from the aster family specialists, sunflower specialists. So we have a great diversity in terms of what they look like and what they feed on and where they live. Many of these are from my yard or from nearby around here in Addison County, just so you know. And some of the important work has come from, so Vermont Center for Eco Studies led survey work over 2019 to 2022. They also went back and looked at historical museum records in the state, of which there aren't that many. But they had over 1,500 people involved in their project looking for Vermont's wild bees over that 3-year period, and observed 330 wild bee species over a 3-year period, which is pretty incredible. But the report that they published at the end of the survey found that 55, or about 15% of Vermont's wild bee species are in urgent need of conservation, and about 30% are imperiled to some degree. So why are some of these species struggling so much? The things that pollinators face are the same types of challenges that many different types of wildlife are facing. So we can put them into some big buckets: habitat loss or degradation, so not having enough food and shelter to work with, pesticides, which is the threat I'm going to talk about most today, diseases and threats or competition from non-native species, and then climate change. You know, we see this in the fires and the floods and the droughts every year. These bees and other pollinators are facing new threats and new changes in how weather and precipitation are affecting their populations. I think that, you know, we had almost 90% of our species are ground nesters. I think with the flooding last year, we probably are going to see lower numbers of some of those species next year in the areas affected by flooding. Hopefully they'll be able to bounce back. But we're going to talk mostly today about pesticides, and if you're interested in learning more about habitat loss or climate change and how we can play roles in those stressors, I would encourage you to go to the VPIRG webinars that we've held before, and to the Xerces YouTube channel. We have webinars on all of those topics that we can go into more depth on. But today we're here to talk about one thing, which is pesticides. And when I use the word pesticide, I'm using it as kind of this umbrella term, so it's not just insecticides, it's also inclusive of herbicides and fungicides and rodenticides, all the sides, something that's intended to kill something that's not wanted. Pesticide pollution is really a global issue. We use pesticides in our agriculture, we use pesticides for cosmetic reasons in our urban environments, in natural areas. So this is a study that came out in Nature that was estimating the risk from pesticide pollution on farmland, and found that 65% of the world's farmland faces high risk from pollution from pesticides moving into soil, moving into water. The thing about pesticides is that even though they have potentially an economic purpose for where they're used, they don't stay where they are applied. So many of these chemicals are very mobile. Current use pesticides are detected in Arctic snow, in high elevation lakes, in rainfall, all the way around the country and around the globe. You can see it's really a global problem, and many pose some level of harm to people and wildlife. When we think about pesticides and pollinators specifically, we talk about a few things that really pose particular risks for when we're trying to figure out, okay, which pesticides do we need to focus on? So when we talk risk, there's really two things that make something risky to any organism, whether it's a bee or a person. It's the toxicity, so how harmful is that pesticide, and then the exposure. What's the dose that you're receiving? So it's the dose makes the poison. And so for pollinators, the things that are red flags for different pesticides are things that are highly toxic, that are often in widespread use or move away from where they're applied very easily, that are persistent and don't break down quickly, and that have some kind of exposure pathway that overlaps with pollinators. So what does that look like? These are some images of how pollinators might be exposed to pesticides in their daily lives. So they might come into a flower that's being sprayed directly. This is like the worst case scenario for a pollinator. They're on a flower and a pesticide gets applied. But they might also visit a flower that was previously sprayed. Maybe somebody was spraying at night to try and avoid spraying a pollinator, but then there's residues on the plant the next day. We have a lot of species here that either nest in the ground or collect mud or leaf material. So mason bees and leafcutter bees collect those materials and use them for their nesting walls. So you could have a bee that collects contaminated materials or lives in a nest site that has some contamination. And then you also have some pesticides that are what's called systemic. So these are pesticides that are water soluble and can get taken up into plants because they're taken up with water from the roots. And these can contaminate plants from the inside, including pollen and nectar, the leaf tissue. So if you have a butterfly feeding on a plant that's has a systemic pesticide inside of it, or a bee bringing back pollen and nectar from a contaminated plant. Then those baby bees might be exposed for a long time in their nests. So where are systemic insecticides used? They're in common use in many different environments. So they're registered on hundreds of crops and used in some cases. This is an example of seed treatments, which we're going to talk more about. So seeds get coated with a systemic insecticide so that they can move up into the plant as it starts to grow and provide protection against pests. We'll talk more about that. They're in common use in nurseries. So nurseries, pests that are things like aphids and whiteflies that feed on a plant. Something like a systemic insecticide is very attractive because it can protect the entire leaf tissue from attacks from those types of sucking and feeding insects. It's also used in grub treatments for lawns, as well as treatments on trees for things like emerald ash borer. You hear about, oh, my tree got treated for emerald ash borer. That's usually a trunk injection of a systemic insecticide. So how many people in this room have heard about neonicotinoids? That makes sense. So neonics were introduced in the 90s as to great fanfare because they were a new class of insecticides that had very high efficacy against insect pests and lower human impacts than some of the previous older chemicals. But they also have the kind of particular set of characteristics that makes them highly toxic to bees and also very risky because there's a lot of exposure pathways that overlap with bees. They're also very persistent. So sometimes when they're applied to something like a woody plant, they can be present for years. Same thing in the soil. We find neonics in the soil after they've been used years prior. So they're very persistent chemicals. All of these together means neonics are very high risk, and they're also they've gone into they've increased rapidly over the last 30 years in terms of use. So this is from 1995 to 2015, showing just how quickly these were adopted in a variety of different crops. And this is another way of visualizing that, but it shows you a different story. So this is actually increased toxic load for pollinators across the landscape. And I'll walk you through this one. So one of the things that you'll hear from the ag industry is that we use lower quantities of insecticides now than we did 30 years ago. So we apply less volume of insecticides to our crops than we did 30 years ago. But what they won't tell you is that what we see now is 3 times the amount of toxic load for pollinators, driven mostly by neonic increases. And that's just because of the toxicity of those chemicals for pollinators. So organophosphates, which are older chemicals, started to get phased out. Those go on in pounds per acre. Neonics go on in ounces per acre, but they have so much more toxicity for bees that you actually see a greater increased toxic load for pollinators. So pollinating insects face more challenges on the landscape now than they did 30 years ago in terms of pesticide risk. That's just something to think about. Neonics aren't the only part of that story. Pyrethroids were another replacement for organophosphates. Really common use, also very highly toxic to pollinators. They're just not systemic, so we talk about them less. So let's talk about seed treatments in particular, because this is part of what we're trying to deal with on the policy side. Seed treatments are, like I said, a coating on the seed of an insecticide. They're used on basically 100% of corn acres across the US have an insecticide on the seed, typically a neonic, mostly a neonic. The vast majority of other row crop acreage, over 80% of soybean, winter wheat, a variety of other row crops have these seed treatments on them, and increasingly in other crops as well, vegetable crops. We're actually starting to see seed treatments used in wildflowers. Thankfully, at this point, it seems to be mostly fungicides or bioinoculants, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody at some point tries to throw an insecticide on a wildflower. One of the things that's really troubling about these is how little is actually taken up by the plant versus ending up in the environment around the seed. So I'm sure people in the back can't read this. This is 2 to 3% of the active ingredient on that. The pesticide is lost at planting as dust. That's the same amount that ends up in the plant. So 2 to 3% ends up in the plant, 2 to 3% lost as dust at time of planting. The rest ends up in water and soil and leaches out into other plants in the environment or into our waterways, where they are very highly toxic to aquatic invertebrates. So if we care about our fishing, we care about our recreation, it all sort of comes from, this is widespread environmental contamination. So this is a slide I got from Sam Elger, who's in the back of the room here from Vermont Bee Lab, thank you. Sam has been doing this amazing research project in collaboration with Vermont Beekeepers Association to sample pollen from hives at the time of corn planting, to figure out what bees are actually bringing back into the hive at the time that you're getting that dust off when corn is being planted. At this point, last year I believe, they found that almost a quarter of pollen samples were positive for at least one of the highly toxic neonics that are used on seeds. And importantly, those levels that were found were above levels that were known to cause harm, some kind of physiological impact. So most of those exposures were likely to impact behavior or impact some kind of physiology on the honeybee. They also found neonics in goldenrod that was coming up next to cornfields. So goldenrods bloom a long time after corn is planted. But because of the long-term contamination of those soils, you're getting uptake into plants that are next to farm fields, and at levels that could harm pollinators. So this is really a concern. These are used across almost 150 million acres that we know of in the US. And so that's a lot of acreage in terms of field margin vegetation that could be impacted by these seed treatments. What's more, there's very little evidence that they provide any yield benefit for corn. So the vast majority of field trials have found that they have no significant benefit in corn yield when you use neonic-treated seeds compared to untreated seeds. There was a trial conducted this year by UVM Extension at their farm up in Alberg that had the same findings, basically no difference in yield between neonic-treated seed and untreated corn. So I think the question is, why are we accepting this level of landscape-wide risk for so little economic benefit? It turns out that treated seeds are a very difficult system to break out of. We're sort of the end of the supply chain here in Vermont for corn seed, and almost 100% of corn seed have a seed coating applied to them well before they get to Vermont. So Paul's going to talk more about the state level policy to try and help solve that side of the systemic problem. So I know when I talk about pesticides, it can be kind of a downer. So I do like to end by at least saying we can all make positive change for pollinators in our environment. We know enough about declines to know that we need to take some action. And there's many ways that we can be involved in our communities. So we can work on protecting existing habitat and creating new habitat. These are around the places that we live and work. Even if we're not personally managing or owning land, there's ways we can do it around our towns and communities. We can also educate ourselves, educate others about pollinators, work to understand the issue, and then participate at the community level, at the state level, to engage our communities in conservation. There's something in here for all of us, and I think Vermont is in a good place when it comes to community action because people really care, and I think we can really make a difference. PPAC has shown us that in Addison County. I have a few example handouts on the tables in the back, but we have all of these resources downloadable free on the Xerces website, so if you want to learn more, please visit us there, visit our YouTube channel and the Pollinator Pathway YouTube channel, and I'm happy to take questions after Paul's talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was certainly educational, and maybe it gave us some idea of why we're here tonight. So So now Paul Burns is going to speak, and he is the executive director of Vermont Public Interest Research Group. And he said, don't bother about a big introduction, just let me talk, which is great. So here he is, and we really appreciate him, and his team coming all the way over here from central Vermont and over the mountains with a big snowstorm and so on. So thank you for coming.
See how this works. Does that sound all right? Yep. Excellent. Well, it is a pleasure to be with you this evening. Great to see so many of you, and as Emily said, to actually be in person is fantastic. So thanks for coming out. Thanks for your concern for pollinators. It is something that we care deeply about at VPIRG. I would just say VPIRG, as many of you probably know, because you probably had somebody knock on your door in the summer months, we work on a broad range of issues. We're most well known for our work on environmental issues and clean energy and climate change, though we also work on other consumer protection issues, healthcare, democracy, environmental justice, so a whole range of things that we work on. I've been with VPIRG for about 23 years, and I started my work with PIRGs even before that in New York, and I spent 8 years in Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, about 24 years ago, I was working as an advocate with MassPIRG, Massachusetts PIRG, in Boston. And at that time, we were trying to pass pesticide legislation. This is how long I've been working on pesticides. And in that case, so we were focused on schools and child care centers, and trying to prohibit the use of the most toxic, most dangerous pesticides in those locations. And as you may know or just understand, children are uniquely susceptible to harm from all sorts of chemical exposures, in part because of their small bodies. Their hands go immediately into their mouths. They spend a lot of time on the floor where pesticides are, or other chemical residues may be, and dust and so forth. Well, just a quick story there is we were trying to pass this legislation. It was really hard in Massachusetts, even in liberal Massachusetts, liberal Vermont. We know that it's not all puppies and rainbows here. It's hard to pass significant things when you're going after the chemical industry or the pesticide industry or big ag. And so there we were running into a tough time until the House of Representatives was debating the budget. And just to give you a sense of how different things were, and probably still are in Massachusetts, they would debate throughout the night. They went around the clock to pass the state budget. And at some point at about 2 or 3 in the morning, members of the House there forgot that other people were still there and watching them. And what they often did at that time was they would hold fundraisers, maybe inside or just outside the State House, that lobbying organizations would attend. There would be free-flowing alcohol. So this mix of factors, they were bored. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. They forgot that anybody was watching, and they were boozed up pretty good. Convinced them that what they should do at that time was get into a conga line on the floor of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and they were doing the whole thing. And on the front page of the Boston Herald the next day was a massive, because there were actually photographers still there, and it said "Animal House" in the largest font possible. The Speaker of the House at that time, Tom Finneran, was for days just crowded by media who wanted to know how could he possibly let this happen, and he was just in real crisis mode, and he was having a tough time. I happened to be around the scrum of reporters one time when they caught him about 3 days later, and one reporter asked him a question that didn't have to do with the Animal House of that night. They said, "What are you going to do about this legislation to protect kids from pesticides?" Now, Tom Finneran did not care about that legislation, and did not like me personally. I think I can say this now. But he grabbed onto that bill, which I had named the Children's Protection Act, because legislators don't typically want to be on the other side of a bill called the Children's Protection Act, and he said, yes, we are going to pass that legislation to protect children from those dangerous pesticides, and they did. And they passed it, and not only that, they improved it, and then renamed it the Children's and Families Protection Act. And so I recognize that what we are doing here is a mix of things. We want to have the experts, Emily, and I know there are many others in the room here tonight, who know the facts, who know the detailed information about the risks, the threats that certain pesticides can pose. And then we also need a campaign that can connect with people around the state, hopefully at just the right time, with just the right message, and just the right opportunity to connect with your legislator when they need to hear from you, when that bill has a chance of being taken up and considered by the legislature. And that's where VPIRG and a whole coalition of other organizations kind of comes in here. I am not the expert. I didn't go to school on pesticides. I've worked on it for a long time. But I am the one of those folks who knows how to try to get something done in the State House when there is a need to provide greater protections for pollinators in this case. But by the way, it's not even just bees and butterflies, but all sorts of other species affected by these neonic pesticides. We are trying to create an environment, an atmosphere in which that kind of legislation could be favorably considered by those legislators. So that's what the goal is for VPIRG in this campaign. Now, tell me which one of these buttons I should hit. It's not that one. Wait a minute.
So
Oh.
it'll be that arrow.
I gotta hit that one.
Well, now it's on this one. This is the slide you're on.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you gotta be right close to me here, I think. All right, so POP VT, again, we try to think about things that might be easy to remember. Protect Our Pollinators is what POP stands for. And there is a coalition of organizations that came up with this neat logo and are working together to try to advance this kind of policy in Vermont that would provide greater protection to our pollinators. These are some of the organizations, many of which you are probably familiar with, many of which you have probably contributed to. If you can't see them all here, I'm not going to read them all to you, but you'll see names that you recognize here. And these are just some of the organizations that have formally come together. There are many others who we know have deep concerns about pollinators and what we can do to protect them. You've already heard, thankfully, from Emily on some of the challenges that pollinators face. I get it. I am hitting it. We're going to talk about pesticides. And there we go. Okay, and again, you've heard, I think probably plenty, and you probably came in knowing a good deal about neonics. And again, a threat not just to the target pests, but to beneficial insects, to bees and butterflies, and all sorts of other species as well. Our goal then is to phase out the use of toxic neonic pesticides in Vermont, and at the same time try to help farmers transition to more sustainable alternatives. And that's an important, it's kind of a two-part program. So where are we now in this? I want to note a couple of bills that have been passed into law in recent years in Vermont, banning the use of retail use of neonics. That did have a loophole that excluded treated articles. In 2022, there was an attempt to close that loophole, and there was opposition to that, so we created the Ag Innovation Board. So these are kind of steps in the right direction, you might say, but we have not yet done it. And so 2024 is the year we hope to pass legislation that will phase out the use of most of the neonic pesticides in Vermont. That is our goal, to make no bones about it. That's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to hide that fact from anybody. And we have been working, 2024 is the second year of a 2-year biennium, is the way our legislature works. Most of you are probably familiar with that. The legislature is in every single year from typically the first Wednesday of January through about the first week of May. That's how long they are in session. And they do that whether the year is an election year or an off year. So they had the first year of the biennium last year, and we're on the back half of the biennium this year. It is difficult, it is always challenging to bring up a bill that is a significant bill with significant opposition in one half of the biennium. That's the 1-year session in 2024. But we're going to try to do it because we've been trying to build some momentum and make good connections around the state on this issue in the off year. There are a couple of photos from New York State. This is the $1 Million Staircase. If you've ever been in the New York State Capitol, there's a whole story of that I'm not going to get into, but there are a lot of press conferences take place there. It's a beautiful, beautiful spot. In New York, they were working to pass legislation called the Birds and the Bees Protection Act. That's also pretty good. I got to give them credit for that. Very, very clever. And it is very similar to what we're trying to do here. It passed the New York State Assembly, 99-46, passed the Senate 45-16. Again, prohibits the sale and distribution of the neonics on corn, soybean, wheat, seeds that are treated with these neonic pesticides in New York. This is a good bit of what we would like to do here, although we're hoping to go even a bit further than New York State in terms of what we want to do. If it passed both the Assembly and the Senate, why isn't it law yet? Because it is on the desk of Governor Hochul in New York State, and she has until the end of the year to decide whether she will sign that legislation or not. If you know anybody in New York State, this is a great time to have them encourage Governor Hochul to sign that legislation. So in Vermont, we're trying to draft legislation, again, looking at the treated seeds. You've heard about most of these seeds, nearly all the corn, a lot of the soy, wheat, other cereal seeds are treated with neonics. We want to stop that practice, phase it out over several years, and prohibit some of the outdoor uses of neonic pesticide that create significant risks to the pollinator population. Spraying of flowering or tasseling crops, applications to ornamental plants and turf grass. Those are things that we would be addressing in the Vermont legislation. It is not possible to pass this legislation without some exemptions. I will just tell you the politics would not allow for that, and so we wanted to grant some process by which there could be exemptions granted, so if the market doesn't develop if there are no seeds available, we're not going to force farmers to go out of business, to not plant in the state. There are things we'll do to try to ensure that that doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened elsewhere where states, provinces, countries have moved in a different direction. But still, we needed to have this in here. They would have to demonstrate, it's not an easy bar for them, but it is possible. The other thing we did is we didn't just leave it up to the Agency of Agriculture. In Vermont, as in most states, the Agency of Ag tends to be a little more favorably inclined toward whatever farmers want to do, or have done. The Agency of Natural Resources, the environmental agency, sometimes take a somewhat more aggressive view when it comes to pollution generally and the use of pesticides in particular. So this would require them to work together on this, but giving more of a voice to the environmental agency we think would be helpful. AAFM is the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and Agency of Natural Resources here. So again, must include detailed findings and would not cause undue harm to pollinators, the environment, or public health. This is a pretty good state. If we could get this done, that would be a tighter process than New York or some other places that have offered this process. Vermont bill with respect to restricted use pesticides removes the regulatory distinction between the neonics and neonic treated seeds, whether it's sprayed or in the plant itself. Because of the way this acts, and Emily talked about this, if it is a systemic use pesticide, so much of it getting into the environment, even if it's on the seeds, I think a lot of people are quite surprised by that more than 90% of all of the pesticide on that seed coating doesn't even get taken up by the plant, isn't even serving its purpose in that way, you might say, and instead is getting into the environment where it can last for many years and travel great distances, particularly once it gets into waterways. And so that's a significant issue that we're trying to address there. So again, we're not alone in this. The European Union has banned neonic use fairly recently, and Quebec, and I believe Ontario as well. Is that true? Yes, Ontario banned neonics. I think that's right. What we're finding in these areas, for instance, looking to Quebec, is a decrease in treated seeds there. So again, it was prevalent, highly prevalent prior to this restriction going in. Now much less usage, and we're not seeing any related change in crop yield. This seems to be consistent with the data and research elsewhere, including here in Vermont. The farmers, in other words, can still farm. and if the seeds are available to them, they do not, in Quebec, immediate neighbor to the north, appear to be suffering financially, and their crop yields are the same, very similar. And so farmers might understandably be concerned when we're talking about changing a practice in this way, and because they're fed a line by the people selling them the seeds that you can't possibly get away without this. The fact is, farmers are doing it without neonic treated seeds today in a very nearby province. And so this could be very, very valuable information for us to try to make the case in the legislature. Okay, so I think this kind of is covering some of that same ground that we were just talking about. Some farmers move to diamide insecticides, others abandon the insecticide treatments altogether. Diamide we know is not great. In some respects it's less harmful. Well, there are other people here who know a lot more about it than I do, but I know it's a problem for some of the pollinators. But definitely getting rid of neonics would be a huge win overall for the pollinator population. How do we pass the legislation? Well, we get a nice bee image here, and then strategies, research, educate, organize, advocate. We are doing all of these things, but we depend on others primarily for the research, and you've heard a good bit and seen it. It's compelling. I'm imagining this being presented in a committee of legislators, and if they are open-minded, as many Vermont legislators are to this kind of thing, that's very powerful information that you have already seen about the threat that is posed by this pesticide, the opportunity to move forward without it in ways that would not jeopardize farming activities in this state. So then why the heck do you want to use this stuff and jeopardize bees and pollinators? I mean, so this is where we want to get to. And then we do events like this in terms of educating folks, organizing, etc. We're holding events. We have had the wonderful Samantha Alger and Charlie Nardozzi. Some of you heard of Charlie Nardozzi, did a great event up in Burlington earlier. We have this event, we're doing all sorts of events on campuses and other places. Communications, we're doing video interviews with different folks who have different connections to bees and pollinators, and we're trying to do very short 1 minute, 2 minute videos, and then we'll put them out on social media, on the website, and so forth, so people begin to see it's not just people who make honey, although they're very important when it comes to protecting pollinators, but you got bees wrap, and you have craft brewers, and you have flower farms, and you have all sorts of places out there that have connections and a need for a healthy pollinator population. And we want to begin to open the public's eyes so that they are a little more aware of this than they might have been beforehand. So that's a neat thing that we're doing. Lots of social media. We need letters to the editor. We need opinion editorials. We need people to engage on this and show others that you care. We have petitions, as you may have seen, out on front on the way in. My friend Liz has a couple of petitions there for folks to sign. These petition signatures for us are very important because they're a way for us to identify people who care about this issue and agree with us that we should try to phase out the use of these pesticides. It's also a way for us to connect with individuals who have this concern at just the right time with just the right message and try to get that to legislators. And then we may present the overall number of people who have signed to legislators in those different communities as well. And they can see, oh, people I know or just people in my district who have signed this. That can be a compelling demonstration of public support that helps to move legislators. Because being right on the issue is not enough to get a bill passed in the legislature. The legislators must also see this is also a great way for me to get reelected because people care about this. So if you have that combination of, they are compelled, they find the information compelling and they believe that their constituents want them to do it, that's the combination that we're looking for here. Okay, so lots of coalition activity, including Vermont Pollinator Working Group, which is a whole other coalition of groups, beekeepers and others who are coming together also with an aim to educate folks about pollinators and to help to protect them in Vermont. When we're talking about advocacy, this is, in the legislature, we're working to identify lead sponsors right now for this legislation. Representative Robin Chestnut-Tangerman is likely to be the chief sponsor for this piece of legislation, and we are that the bill is literally being drafted by legislative counsel. These are the lawyers who work for legislators. VPIRG has been working with, again, a coalition of organizations on this. Conservation Law Foundation has an attorney who's been helping to craft some of these concepts, and we have shared that with the legislator. We are in touch with legislative counsel, and as soon as that bill is drafted, we'll be working to try to identify other legislators who could sign on. It's always helpful to have a good number of legislators who have put their name on a bill when it is first introduced, because it's just a demonstration of legitimate support. I will say, this is an area where you all can come into play, because you have an inordinate number of powerful legislators from this area, as you all probably know well. So you've got a couple of senators, Senator Hardy, Senator Bray, who are chairs of important committees, and Representative Amy Sheldon, also chair of the Key Environment Committee on the House side. They are going to be very important if this legislation is to move forward. And of course, any of the other legislators also key important, but these are real leaders and potential to demonstrate significant influence, I would say, over the legislative process. We'll identify witnesses. Again, some of you here tonight could potentially be an excellent witness, and we'll prepare or work with others to prepare testimony. So we've talked about Be the Change. Signing the petition is a great way to begin to participate in this process. Contacting your legislators, as I was just saying, helping to spread the word. Would you mind standing up? My friend Anna here has a wonderful t-shirt that we have created for this purpose. Wear it with pride, and have people ask you about it, what they can do to help. That's one of those things that we are promoting here as well. But the point here is, it is a heavy lift. I will tell you that, to move this legislation from start to finish between now and the first week or so of May, but it is not impossible. And in particular, if Governor Hochul signs that bill in New York, that takes away a whole set of opposition, because they say, they can't say, well, Vermont wouldn't have access to seeds. If New York State has access to seeds right next door, we would put all the elements that would go into effect, we would do it at the same rate and time as New York. So that would make our job a whole lot easier. If Governor Hochul vetoes it, or if she amends it in significant ways, then we have our work cut out for us. And but I can tell you one thing, even if we don't get it done by the first week of May, the problem isn't going to solve itself. We will be here and we'll continue to work on this campaign, even if it takes a little bit longer than 6 months, because that's what we do. So thank you for the opportunity, and happy to answer any questions with Emily.
Close this, right? Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for those. And I'm sure many of us have questions, so we have time. Got about 15 minutes, so who would like to start? Margie.
So I have a question for hello lady. I was researching Unix, and I ended up writing this article, but didn't know anything about it before. And I was so impressed by the woman pediatrician in New York State who talked on a webinar that I think I listened to, and talked about how it was affecting children. And the groundwater in Long Island and how much it's affected. Those things really bother me. So I'm just wondering if you're also going to be finding doctors and speaking about human health also, because it seems to be a big concern.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. And I will tell you that in New York State, we have, not surprisingly, been in touch with the advocates there who successfully got that bill passed through the House, through the Assembly and the Senate there. NRDC is one of the leading organizations there that was involved in it, and they made clear to us that the human health impacts, or potential human health impacts and concerns there, were an important part of the campaign to move this forward. So we talk a lot about bees, and there is frankly more data, more scientific data about the impacts on on bees, on pollinators, and certain other species than we have for humans. That there are studies that indicate a significant potential threat to human health. I don't want to overplay the hand, and so we're kind of looking into what's the best thing that we can say. But what I will tell you, one of the other things that they did was they got a individual letters signed by different constituencies. So one was medical professionals, another was craft brewers, another was farmers. And each letter was maybe a 1.5, 2-page letter that went into details about why we specifically are concerned and why we specifically want to see this passed. So one of those was a letter signed by healthcare professionals, including these doctors that you mentioned. We're going to try to do something like that here as well. It's a short answer to your question, and we'll see what we can do. If anybody has connections to medical professionals, we'd love to hear about it. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on that, the amount of pesticides that's being found in breast milk today should be horrifying to people. And it's something, I don't remember the numbers, but it's like in the 80s to 90% of breast milk has significant amounts of these pesticides. That's really disgusting to think about, these poor babies.
Yeah, and I will say VPIRG has done studies in the past looking at a range of toxic chemicals. We call them a body burden study. So looking at not just pesticides, although that's part of it, but BPA or other chemicals that leach from plastics and so forth. And we went out and found some Vermonters that people knew about. So we did this some years ago, and David Zuckerman was one of them, the current lieutenant governor, also a farmer. And he had, I think you'd say this because it was released publicly, but he had unusually high numbers of some of these chemicals in his body. He's an organic farmer, to be clear, so I don't want to mislead anybody here, but he had some of the other chemicals, and one of them was one that leaches from plastic, and he said he always had this container in the tractor that he drank from all the time, and it was before he had the BPA-free model there. So anyway, it's true, it is in breast milk, it is in urine, we are finding it, there is a lot to be concerned about there.
Denise?
Yeah, so getting back to the seed costs and stuff, the price of the seed without the treatment, is that cheaper than the seed with the treatment? Just curious.
Well, I'm afraid the answer is no, but it's, I'm looking to others. Emily?
At this point, no. With our current market conditions, no. But in Quebec, where they did institute the ban, it became cheaper to get untreated seed, which is why farmers haven't been purchasing the insecticide-treated alternative. It's been cheaper to get the untreated seed. But currently, you have to order untreated seed in September, when most farmers are ordering it in February. So it's not cheaper.
It's working against them.
Yeah, it's harder to get.
It is one reason why we also have a transition period, so this wouldn't take effect, I think it's still 27, if it were to pass in 2024. So there's time for farmers to understand that process and for the market to develop. Yeah.
Money's always an issue.
For sure.
Danny?
Who proved to be the primary opponents to the bill in New York, and do you expect the same forces here in Vermont?
We do. It's the people who make the pesticides.
Who said?
Monsanto, large chemical, it's chemical manufacturers, pesticide manufacturers of that sort. And they are very, very powerful, and they have a lot of money that they spend both in lobbying and sometimes in campaign contributions. And we've worked on the other side of them on a number of different issues. GMO labeling was another example there. But Vermont, some years ago, became the first and only state to pass the requirement for GMO labeling. So it is possible to win, even against these big and powerful opponents. What happened to that law is, again, another story I'd be happy to talk about offline. But, and then Big Ag, the Farm Bureau in New York State, which is often in line with chemical company interests. They're not just looking out for the best interests of the small farmers out there. It's more of a political body, and they take also direction from the National Farm Bureau, which never wants to lose a battle about farmer access to any pesticide that they want to use. So, so it is unlikely that we would see a very different reaction here. But important to note, the Farm Bureau is one thing, and we're happy to work with them and get, maybe they'll surprise us. I would love that. And they would say, Vermont's different. We're going to do things differently here. I would love that to be the case. But if it's not, we still wanna see if we can attract other individual farmers to be part of this. As I've said to others, this can't be a campaign for the likes of us are against the salt of the earth farmers of Vermont state. We can't afford that to be the message and the way this campaign is perceived. And it's not that way. I think a lot of farmers, what we have learned is that they don't even know what their seeds may be treated with. They don't understand that, and whatever they know about it probably comes from the people selling them the seed. So there is an opportunity, we think, to help them better understand what they're using and why, and what might be the difference if they switch to something that didn't have this toxic pesticide coating. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
That's great.
Just for clarity, Monsanto was bought by Bayer a number of years ago, so it's Bayer and Syngenta are the biggest players in coating seeds.
Yeah, thank you.
And BASF.
BASF, Germany, right?
Or is it Germany?
Well, we're BASF, you've heard of, you've seen the ads probably. I think, okay.
So, I have to admit, I was Googling something on my phone because I was really curious as you were talking about legislative boudoir and I was thinking about the Commerce Clause and whether or not this could implicate the Commerce Clause and have some sort of federal intervention on states passing these laws. Fortunately, it seems not. But what I did see was that there are many states that create preemptions where local governments cannot ban pesticide use. Vermont does not seem to be one of them. So is that something that you all would pursue too at the more like really ground level, encouraging towns to pass this, or is it purely like state level down?
It's a really intensive thing to try to go, community by community to pass this. Sometimes we do that in order to prove that it is possible, that it works, the farmers in this area were able to do it. We're hoping not to have to do that because it does extend the timeline quite significantly, and that you're fighting. We won't have the resources to do that. I mean, believe it or not, in this case, it's easier, to try to fight it once at the state level to do that. But you're absolutely right that some states have passed this kind of thing. We fight that at the state level. We also fight at the federal level, because what happened to our GMO labeling is that Congress passed a law that said states can't pass GMO labeling laws.
Yeah.
That's what happened to our GMO labeling law. And so it's the same kind of idea that we press against. If somebody wants to be more protective for public health or pollinators, et cetera, we think that they should have the capacity to do that.
I have two thoughts on that. One is that it's really difficult to do community level intervention in the seed market. So for the seed market, this type of a bill is going to at least need to happen at the state level. I would love to see it happen at the federal level, where we didn't even really get into this, but the US EPA is the primary agency responsible for regulating pesticides, and they have a mandate from FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide Rodenticide Act, to do that. Under that law, there is an exemption specific to treated seed. It's treated particles. So it is exempted from traditional pesticide regulation. The pesticidal substance on the outside of the seed is regulated as a pesticide, but it's not tracked and doesn't have the same record-keeping requirements that traditional pesticides would have. So it doesn't have to be written down in the pesticide use on a farm like other pesticides would. So there's this whole federal loophole that there is a public comment period open for that right now. So
Can they find something on your website?
they could, we did a recent Orbis blog post with all of the links. So if you go to the Orbis blog and you look there, we have some suggestions for what you could comment on the public comment period. The second thought about preemption, is that there's currently an amendment to the proposed farm bill, which would basically a rider on the farm bill, which would say to all states, no local communities can go beyond what the state can regulate in terms of pesticides. So there are states that allow for local communities to go beyond, to be stronger. They don't like that. So there's currently an amendment that will also need to have some pushback on preemption.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Abby?
Would it be safe to assume that an organic farmer is not using seeds with any kind of pesticide coating?
Not that they wouldn't be using any pesticide coating, but it wouldn't be any of these conventional insecticides. They could potentially use something like a legume inoculant that is an organic substance. It would have to be an organic approved substance.
We may add that it is also possible their soil could become contaminated by a neighboring or a farm someplace else which is using these methods. So through no fault of their own, could end up having that kind of problem too.
So organic farmers are able somehow to get uncoated seeds.
Yes, there are untreated organic seeds. The difference being that they don't necessarily have all of the same genetic material that the hybrid corn seeds offered conventionally do. So one of the difficulties under the current system is that people looking for the latest and greatest yield traits or disease resistant traits or whatever is being built into the conventional breeding programs, they aren't able to access seeds that don't have the seed coating but have the latest genetic breeding traits. So it's actually an issue of farmer choice. Farmers can't, it's a difficult choice to make to be able to get untreated seed when you have to order it far in advance and it costs more under the current conditions. Farmers don't have the choice.
We were just, my husband and I were just at a different event, and he happened to make a comment to someone there who used to be the head of the Farm Bureau in Addison County, and he said, oh, we're going to another event tonight. He said, oh, what's that? And he said, well, we're going to learn about pesticide use in Vermont and how it affects pollinators. And the guy reared up and he said, well, the farmers want to know what the alternative is. So that seems like an opening, doesn't it? So how can we work with some of the conventional farmers who are using these seeds, bring them into this conversation? I mean, I'm sure you're talking to the organic farmers. They know about this, but how do we bring them in? It's just so, it's like it's a logjam between us and them.
I've had this conversation quite often, and I'm also a farmer as a beekeeper, and looked upon by dairy farmers as a farmer. So there's a couple key things. I've had very good conversations with them. They do not want to be hurting my industry. I don't want to be hurting theirs. And they very much know that pollinators benefit their farm. And that's one thing that's not seen in this neonicotinoid use, where you say it's not benefiting the crop and they're using it, but it's doing things to pollinators that do benefit their crops. And that's not even taken into account here. There was an EPA study I saw at one of the conferences where pollinators may contribute 30 to 40% to row crops, okay? So the other thing about these chemicals getting in the soil is they're destroying their soil. And it's a very good study on that thing. Microbes, beetles, earthworms, all your beneficial insects are dying. So you have dead soil as a result from these chemical use. That's going to interest the farmer. Ironically, it makes them more dependent on synthetic fertilizers and things which are sold by the same companies that are selling them these seeds. Okay? But their soil is no longer benefiting their plants. They're putting manure on their soil, on the dead soil. We talk about all the water problems. This hasn't been studied, I can't refer to studies, but think about it. You put manure on live soil, and there's a microbial orgy, and you end up with great fertile soil. They're putting manure on dead soil, and it sits there until it rains. And then it goes into our waterway and into Lake Champlain, the mud puddle that's between us and New York. It's the lowest point, and it all ends up in there, and we talk about our water quality. So I think if you talk to farmers about what it's doing to them, the only difference between them and me is they have a larger animal that's not as susceptible. But these chemicals are not only not benefiting them, they're detrimental to their farms. And often it's land they've owned for generations and things. And I think you need to put it there. Vermont farmers like to make their own decisions. It's tough to make your own decisions when you're gonna milk the cows 3 times a day and you're not paying your bills and these industry loves them to be in that situation. But there's some key points there that I think are very good talking points if you're talking to a farmer. And the fact that these are not benefiting their crop in the first place. They don't wanna put stuff out there that's not benefiting their crop and be detrimental to something that does benefit their crop. It's a dead loss.
Just, I'll comment and then go to you, Mike, but we are also, as members of our coalition, we've got NOFA, which Northeast Organic Farmers Association, and rural Vermont, so farming interest groups. Just wanted to make sure to note that they are part of this. They aren't necessarily have large numbers of the conventional farmers, and that's what we want to talk about, but we need more of those kind of connections to be made for sure. Yeah, Mike?
You know, you have to live in the world of the realities of what you can accomplish politically. But it's also something where the whole system is not very rational. The idea that we can put something water soluble on a seed where it goes in the soil, the water system, and think it doesn't end up in us, it certainly will. But the time it takes for it to be proved as a carcinogen or somehow other harm takes decades, because we have all the other toxins in our environment. How can we actually sort it out? And prospective improvement means that all they have to do prospectively is prove there's no residue left in the apple that you purchase at the store or whatever else it might be. And Bayer is also a pharmaceutical company. They're used to spending billions of dollars proving that their pharmaceuticals are safe before they get to market, and proving that there's no collateral damage to it. And so this is not something we can accomplish in the Vermont legislature, but imagine if the industry had to pay for the research to prove that it was effective, safe, not residue that was harmful to the consumer, and also not affecting the environment by standards we established that would be. And would they pay for it? They trip over one another to pay for it, because they do it now for pharmaceuticals.
You're absolutely right, and for folks that are unaware, that pharmaceuticals are regulated in a very different way than other chemicals, which are assumed safe until proven guilty. That is applied to pesticides and most other use of toxic chemicals, which are in products that you buy and use every day. Again, there's a whole other talk we could have about that. But pharmaceuticals are regulated differently. You got to have that kind of proof up front. The European Union regulates chemicals differently, where they have more of those, the proof required up front than we have in this country.
Not only do we not have the proof required up front, we don't pay for environmental monitoring after the pesticides are released into the environment for common use. So what I would really like them to also pay for is there adverse harm occurring on the environment, having research paid for by industry to see how the follow-up goes. One of the things I didn't include in my talk, I had a slide and then I took it out for time, was around that pesticide regulation piece. Like, what is the actual protection standard that's being used under different legislation at the federal level? FIFRA, which is the law that is EPA's mandate, has an economic risk and benefit that's built into it. So the protection standard is no adverse harm to unreasonable adverse harm to the environment and to humans. And so there is a level of economic benefit that's built into how pesticides are weighed before they go to market. As opposed to the Endangered Species Act, where jeopardy of the species is the protection standard. That's only a very small fraction of species that are protected under that standard.
Would I be trespassing if I made one more question?
Quick, Mike, it has to be.
I want to celebrate the fact that we're all here, because this is 1/3 of the way into the UN's Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. You might well ask, where's the acreage? Where's the effort? Where are the benchmarks? And I would say in this community, it's the folks in this room. And so we're nowhere near what we should be. But I just want to celebrate the fact that we're all here on a winter evening.
So we are out of time for questions, but so if you have questions, ask them to Paul and Emily after. And thank you all so much for coming. And Fran has a couple of gifts that she would like to bring.
Well, those of you who know me know that I'm on a kick of growing oak trees. I collect acorns. I've done it for this is my second year now, and so I have a couple of little oak seedlings. One for you, Emily, and one for you, Paul.
Thank you so much.
And if you can't use them on your property, give them to a friend, find a park or something. They're about this tall, and anyone can do this. Next year, next fall, when the acorns fall down, go out and grab a few, put them in some pots. You can grow them. Oak trees are one of the best trees that we have for caterpillars and moths and butterflies and all of our pollinators. So that's for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had one other quick comment. Denise Jasko is here from the Native Earth Seed. Stand up just a minute, Denise. And we're always looking for places to get native seeds. So she's here from North Clarendon, and she'll be out in the back. You can talk to her. She has a website, and she also designs gardens, so she came to join us, so thanks. So you want me to finish up? Okay. So thanks for everyone for coming, and we have lots of handouts about just about anything you can think of about pollinators. We're giving away some seeds that were all collected locally in a careful way. We didn't over collect, and there's instructions on how to use them. We have refreshments, and I think everybody here signed a petition already, right? If you haven't signed a petition, it's at the back. So there's a table. VPIRG has a table with petitions. Are you selling T-shirts?
Yes, if you have exact cash or a check.
Okay, they can sell T-shirts. So please stay and mingle and have some refreshments.
Do we have honey available?
Yes.
Another example, so they were.
Fran, can we take the petition with us?
Oh,
Other
please,
things?
yes, we have some
Okay.
extra petitions.
I think I would like to say that somebody in Addison County needs to organize us so that we can get petitions, we know where to hand them in, we can get more petitions, we can recruit other people to do petitions, etc.
Be happy to do that.
Would
Be
you
happy to
stand
do
up
that.
and just say a few words about that? 'Cause
Yeah.
we need to know this.
Yeah, hi, I'm Anna. I'm the Environmental Health Associate for VPIRG, and if folks are interested in tabling for us, collecting petition signatures, I'm your contact person. So I'll be right back at the table, and we can exchange contact info, and I can hand you some extra petitions too. So come see me afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.